My name is Elena, and I'm about to tell you a story that sounds like it belongs in a soap opera. But I swear every word is true. It's about betrayal, family secrets, and how a simple DNA test can unravel decades of lies in the most spectacular way possible. The Whitmore Farm has been in our family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather bought the original 200 acres in 1924 with money he'd saved working in the coal mines. Over the decades, the farm grew to 800 acres of prime agricultural land in Kentucky, complete with century-old barns, fertile fields, and a farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of our family. I grew up on that farm alongside my older sister Meredith. We were only 2 years apart, but we couldn't have been more different. I was the one who loved getting my hands dirty, helping Dad with the livestock, learning about crop rotation and soil management. Meredith was always more interested in fashion magazines and talking about how she couldn't wait to leave the boring farm life behind. Our parents, Robert and Helen Whitmore, worked that land with the kind of dedication that only comes from genuine love. Dad would be out in the fields before sunrise, and Mom managed the household while keeping detailed records of every expense, every harvest, every decision that affected our family's legacy. When I graduated high school, I went to agricultural college but came home every summer to work the farm. Meredith went to university in Louisville and rarely visited, except when she needed money. She graduated with a business degree and moved to Atlanta, where she worked in marketing for a tech company. For years, she barely called, except around Christmas or when she wanted to complain about how backward our hometown was. I, on the other hand, moved back home after college and became Dad's full partner in running the farm. I modernized our equipment, implemented sustainable farming practices, and even started a small organic vegetable operation that supplied local restaurants. The farm was thriving under our joint management. Then 5 years ago, everything changed. Dad suffered a massive stroke while checking on the cattle one morning. I found him collapsed in the pasture and rode with him in the ambulance, holding his hand as he struggled to breathe. He survived, but the stroke left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. Mom became his full-time caregiver, and I took over the day-to-day operations of the farm. Suddenly, Meredith was very interested in family affairs again. She started visiting more frequently, always with some excuse about wanting to help during this difficult time. But I noticed she spent most of her visits in Dad's office, going through paperwork and asking Mom detailed questions about the farm's finances and legal structure. "I'm just trying to understand how everything works," she'd say when I questioned her. "I want to be prepared to help if something happens." I was too busy keeping the farm running and too worried about Dad's health to pay much attention to her sudden interest. Looking back, I should have been more suspicious. Dad passed away 2 years later, peacefully in his sleep. Mom was devastated, and I was heartbroken. We held a beautiful funeral in the little church where 4 generations of Whitmores had worshipped. The entire community came to pay their respects to a man who had been a pillar of our rural county. After the funeral, I expected we'd sit down as a family to discuss Dad's will and the future of the farm. I knew from conversations over the years that Dad intended to leave the farm to both Meredith and me, though I assumed I'd have the option to buy her out since she'd never shown any interest in actually farming. But a week after the funeral, Meredith asked to speak with me privately. "Elena," she said, her voice unusually serious, "I need to tell you something about Dad's will." She handed me a legal document that made my blood run cold. According to the paperwork, Dad had revised his will 6 months before his death, leaving the entire farm to Meredith alone. I was to receive only $50,000 and some personal items. "This can't be right," I stammered, reading the document over and over. "Dad would never." "I'm sorry, Elena, but Dad was worried about your ability to handle the business side of things. He thought I'd be better equipped to make the tough financial decisions." Meredith's voice was gentle, but her eyes were cold. "He did mention that you could stay on as a farm manager if you wanted. I'd pay you a fair salary." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. A farm manager? On my own family's land? "I want to see the original will," I said. "I want to talk to Dad's lawyer." "Mr. Henderson retired last year," Meredith replied smoothly. "Dad used a new attorney in Louisville for this revision. Everything's been filed with the probate court already." The next few months were a nightmare. I contested the will, but Meredith's attorney, a slick Louisville firm, presented documentation that seemed ironclad. They had witness signatures, notarization, everything needed for a valid will. My rural lawyer, while honest and hardworking, was outmatched by their resources and expertise. Meanwhile, Meredith began making changes to the farm. She hired a property management company from Atlanta and started talking about maximizing the land's potential. When I objected to some of her decisions, she reminded me that I was now just an employee. I'm trying to modernize this operation, Elena. Dad's way of doing things was outdated. We need to think bigger. The final straw came when she announced plans to sell 400 acres to a development company that wanted to build a shopping center. 400 acres of land that our great-grandfather had bought with his own blood and sweat, that 3 generations of Whitmores had carefully cultivated, was going to become a parking lot. You can't do this, I pleaded. This land is our family's legacy. My family's legacy, she corrected. And legacies don't pay the bills, Elena. This development deal will set us up for life. That night, alone in the old farmhouse that no longer felt like home, I made a decision. I was going to fight this, no matter what it took. I started by hiring a private investigator named Jake Morrison, a former police detective who specialized in document fraud cases. Jake was expensive, but I used every penny of my savings and took out loans against my truck and personal property to pay him. There's something off about this whole situation, Jake told me after reviewing the case. Your sister hadn't shown interest in the farm for years, then suddenly she's the sole heir. And the timing of this whole revision, just months before your father's stroke, seems convenient. Jake began investigating the witnesses who had supposedly signed Dad's revised will. The first witness was a notary in Louisville who claimed to remember Dad coming to her office. But when Jake pressed her for details, her story started falling apart. She described your father as a tall, heavy-set man with gray hair, Jake reported back to me. But your father was short and thin, and he'd been completely bald since his cancer treatment 15 years ago. The second witness was even more problematic. The address on the will matched a building that had been demolished 8 months before the supposed signing date. But Jake's most important discovery came when he analyzed the paper and ink used for the will. The document was supposedly created 6 months before Dad's death, but the paper showed watermarks from a batch that wasn't manufactured until 2 months after Dad had already passed away. Elena, Jake said, his voice grim, this will is a complete fabrication. Your sister didn't just revise your father's will, she created an entirely fake document. I felt vindicated but also sick. My own sister had committed felony fraud to steal our family's farm. But I needed more evidence to prove it in court, and Meredith's lawyers were skilled at deflecting our accusations. That's when Jake suggested something that seemed completely unrelated to the case. Elena, I want you to consider taking a DNA test, one of those ancestry kits you can order online. I stared at him. How is my ancestry going to help with the will case? Just trust me on this one. There's something about your sister's behavior that's been bothering me. The way she talks about her family legacy. The way she seems so confident that she deserves everything. It reminds me of other cases I've worked where family dynamics weren't what they appeared to be. I thought it was a waste of time, but I was desperate. I ordered a DNA kit online and sent in my sample, figuring it couldn't hurt to have more information about our family history. The results came back 3 weeks later, and they changed everything. According to the DNA analysis, I had several genetic matches with other users in the database. But when I looked at the matches more carefully, I realized something shocking. None of my closest genetic relatives had the surname Whitmore. Instead, my strongest matches were with people named Rodriguez, Martinez, and Gonzalez. I called Jake immediately, my hands shaking as I held the printed results. Jake, I think there's been a mistake with my DNA test. It says my closest relatives are Hispanic families, but where? Elena. Jake interrupted gently. What if there wasn't a mistake? What if the test is telling us exactly what we need to know? That afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse and pulled every birth certificate, marriage license, and adoption record I could find for our family. What I discovered made my head spin. My birth certificate showed that I was born Elena Rodriguez, not Elena Whitmore. I had been adopted by Robert and Helen Whitmore when I was 6 months old. My biological parents were Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, migrant farm workers who had been killed in a car accident. But here's the part that destroyed Meredith's entire scheme. There was no adoption record for her. Meredith Whitmore was Robert and Helen's biological daughter. I was their adopted daughter. But under Kentucky adoption law, adopted children have the same inheritance rights as biological children. More importantly, I found Dad's real will in the courthouse records, the one he had filed with his longtime lawyer, Mr. Henderson, before Henderson retired. In that will, Dad explicitly stated that both his daughters, biological and adopted, were to inherit the farm equally. He had even included specific language about how much I meant to him and how proud he was of my dedication to the family farm. The fake will Meredith had created conveniently made no mention of my adoption, instead painting the inheritance decision as purely based on business capabilities. When I called Jake with the news, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Elena, your sister didn't just commit fraud. She tried to use your adoption against you, probably hoping you'd never find out the truth about your parentage. She counted on you not knowing your legal rights as an adopted child." The confrontation came a week later. I met Meredith at the farm, in Dad's old office where she'd been spending so much time during his illness. She was sitting behind his desk, like she owned the place, which, according to her fake will, she did. "Meredith," I said, placing the DNA results and courthouse documents on the desk in front of her, "we need to talk." Her face went white as she saw the papers. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, she looked genuinely scared. "I don't know what you think those prove," she said, but her voice was shaking. "They prove that you forged Dad's will. They prove that you knew I was adopted and tried to use it against me. And they prove that you've been planning this fraud for years." Meredith stood up abruptly, knocking over Dad's coffee mug. "You don't understand, Elena. I am his real daughter. I carry his blood. This farm should be mine." "You're right," I said quietly. "You are his biological daughter. But I'm his daughter too. The daughter who stayed. The daughter who learned everything he had to teach. The daughter who held his hand when he was dying while you were in Atlanta worried about your marketing campaigns." Tears were streaming down her face now. "I never meant for it to go this far. I panicked when I saw the real will. You were getting half of everything, and you're not even really family." "Not really family." I stood up, my voice rising. "I worked this land for 20 years. I sacrificed my own dreams to keep Dad's legacy alive. I took care of him when he was sick and Mom when she was grieving. If that doesn't make me family, then what does?" "Blood," she whispered. "Blood makes you family." I looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Dad didn't choose you, Meredith. You were just an accident of biology. But he chose me. He and Mom chose to make me their daughter, chose to love me, chose to teach me everything they knew about this land. That choice, that love, that's worth more than any DNA test." The legal resolution was swift once we had the evidence. Meredith's forged will was thrown out, and Dad's real will was validated. She was charged with fraud, forgery, and attempted theft of property. Her fancy Atlanta lawyers couldn't explain away the physical evidence of the fake documents. But the most satisfying moment came during the settlement hearing, when Meredith's attorney tried to argue that as the biological daughter, she deserved preference in the inheritance. Judge Williams, who had known our family for decades, looked at the lawyer with barely concealed disgust. "Counselor, this court recognizes no difference between biological and adopted children when it comes to inheritance rights. Elena Rodriguez Whitmore has been a member of this family for 34 years. She has worked this land, cared for her parents, and honored their legacy. The fact that she was chosen rather than born into this family makes her sacrifice and dedication even more remarkable." He turned to Meredith, his voice stern. "Ms. Whitmore, your father left you a generous inheritance, half of one of the most valuable farms in this county. But that wasn't enough for you, was it? You had to have it all. And you were willing to commit felony fraud to get it. Your actions have brought shame on the Whitmore name and dishonor to your father's memory." Meredith received 5 years of probation and was ordered to pay restitution for the legal costs and emotional distress she had caused. More importantly, she was forced to honor Dad's real will, which meant I owned half the farm and had the legal right to buy her out if she wanted to sell her portion. She took the buyout option immediately. I think the shame of what she'd done, combined with the community's reaction to her fraud, made it impossible for her to stay in our small town. She moved back to Atlanta and, as far as I know, never returned to Kentucky. I used part of the insurance money from the farm to pay off all the legal fees and Jake's investigator costs. The rest I invested back into the land, upgrading equipment, and expanding our organic operations. But the most important change was what I did with the knowledge about my biological family. Using the DNA matches and courthouse records, I was able to connect with some of my biological relatives, cousins and aunts who were thrilled to discover I existed. They told me stories about my birth parents, Carlos and Maria, and how heartbroken their families had been when they died so young. It turns out Carlos had been a gifted farmer who had dreamed of owning his own land someday. Maria had been known for her beautiful garden and her way with animals. When I shared photos of the Whitmore Farm with my newly discovered relatives, my biological aunt cried. "Mija," she said, "your father would be so proud. You became everything he dreamed of being." I invited my biological family to visit the farm, and many of them came for a reunion that summer. It was emotional and wonderful to meet people who shared my features, my mannerisms, even my love of working with my hands. But what struck me most was how graciously they accepted my adoptive family as their own. "The Whitmores chose to love you when you needed a family," my biological uncle told me. "That makes them our family too." Today, the farm is more successful than ever. I've married a wonderful man named David who shares my passion for sustainable agriculture, and we're raising our 2 young children to understand and respect the land that 4 generations have called home. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't taken that DNA test. Would Meredith have gotten away with her fraud? Would I have spent the rest of my life believing I was somehow less worthy of my father's love because I wasn't his biological daughter? But then I remember what Dad used to say when I was little and would ask about being adopted. "Elena, some kids get one family by accident. You got 2 families on purpose, the one that gave you life and the one that chose to love you. That makes you twice as lucky as most people." He was right. I am twice as lucky. I got to inherit not just land and property, but 2 family legacies, the Rodriguez tradition of hard work and determination, and the Whitmore commitment to the land and community. Meredith thought she could use my adoption against me, make me feel like an outsider with no claim to our family's heritage. Instead, she helped me discover that I belonged to something even bigger and more beautiful than she could ever understand. The farm is still called Whitmore Farm, and it always will be. But now there's a small garden near the farmhouse where I grow the vegetables my biological mother loved. Tomatoes, peppers, and cilantro that connect me to another heritage. Another story of people who loved the land and believed in the power of family. Blood doesn't make a family, love does. Choice does. Commitment does. And no amount of fraud or forgery can ever change that truth. The Rodriguez Whitmore Farm is thriving, and it will continue to thrive for generations to come, nurtured by the best of both families that made me who I am today.